Whispers of hope. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord. Thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29 verse 11. Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. Leila Morrison stared at the computer screen, her eyes burning from hours of staring at the same rejection email. Thank you for submitting your story, but it's not quite right for us at this time. The words mocked her, a cruel reminder of her failed attempts to break free from the monotony of her corporate job in the heart of Chicago. The bustling city outside her window, filled with the sounds of honking cars and chattering pedestrians, felt like a world away from her cramped office. At 28, Leila had always dreamed of becoming a published writer, but with each passing year, her hope faded a little more. She glanced around the open office space, filled with colleagues who seemed content with their safe, predictable lives. Leila, on the other hand, felt trapped, her creativity stifled by the endless stream of paperwork and spreadsheets. As the clock struck 5, Leila gathered her things and headed out into the busy streets of Chicago. The towering skyscrapers and heavy traffic only added to her sense of confinement. In her small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, she collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing with thoughts of failure and disappointment. Leila had spent countless late nights pouring her heart into her writing, only to face rejection after rejection. The financial strain of pursuing her dream weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was her true calling. With a heavy sigh, she opened her laptop and began typing, determined to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. The next morning, Leila braced herself for another day at the office. As she sat at her desk, her boss, Mr. Hawkins, approached with a stack of papers. "Morrison, I need these reports by the end of the day. And don't forget about the team meeting this afternoon." Leila nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Mr. Hawkins was a demanding and dismissive boss, often overlooking her contributions in favor of her more vocal colleagues. She glanced over at Ethan, her closest friend at the office, who offered her a sympathetic smile. "Hang in there," he mouthed, before turning back to his own work. As the day dragged on, Leila found it increasingly difficult to focus on her tasks. Her mind kept wandering back to the rejection email, the sting of disappointment still fresh. When the team meeting finally arrived, Leila sat quietly, hoping to avoid drawing attention to herself. But fate had other plans. As Mr. Hawkins reviewed the quarterly results, he turned to Leila, his brow furrowed in disapproval. "Morrison, I noticed a discrepancy in these numbers. Can you explain what happened?" Leila's heart raced as all eyes turned to her. She stumbled through an explanation, her voice trembling with nerves. Mr. Hawkins shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "This is unacceptable. I expect better from you, Morrison." Humiliated, Leila retreated to her desk, blinking back tears. Ethan approached, his expression filled with concern. "Hey, you okay?" Leila forced a smile, but the cracks in her facade were starting to show. "I'm fine," she lied, knowing deep down that she was anything but. As the workday drew to a close, Leila found herself wandering through Millennium Park, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of nature amidst the urban chaos. The park was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the pressures of her job and reflect on her dreams. She settled onto a bench, her gaze fixed on the swaying trees and the iconic Cloud Gate sculpture glimmering in the evening light. It was then that she noticed an elderly woman sitting beside her, a kind smile on her face. "It's a lovely evening, isn't it?" the woman said, her voice soft and soothing. Leila nodded, unsure of how to respond. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Mrs. Harper." "Leila," she replied, shaking the woman's hand. "You look troubled, my dear," Mrs. Harper observed. "Is there something weighing on your heart?" Leila hesitated, unsure of why she felt compelled to open up to a stranger. But there was something about Mrs. Harper's gentle demeanor that put her at ease. Before she knew it, the words were spilling out, a torrent of emotions she had been holding back for far too long. Mrs. Harper listened intently, her eyes filled with understanding. When Leila had finished, she reached out and squeezed her hand. "My dear, I know it may not feel like it now, but God has a plan for you. Even when the path ahead seems dark, trust that He is leading you toward a future filled with hope." Leila stared at the woman, her words resonating deep within her soul. But as she opened her mouth to respond, Mrs. Harper rose from the bench, offering her a warm smile. "Remember, Leila, you are never alone. God is with you, and He has great things in store for your life." With that, Mrs. Harper turned and walked away, leaving Leila to ponder her words. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Leila felt a glimmer of hope ignite within her. Perhaps, just maybe, her dreams weren't as impossible as they seemed. Chapter 2: Dreams and Doubts. The following days blurred together, each one a mix of the same mundane tasks and the relentless ticking of the clock in the office. Leila found herself lost in a haze of paperwork, her dreams of becoming a writer feeling more distant with each passing moment. The rejection emails continued to flood her inbox, each one a reminder of her perceived failure. In the cramped confines of her apartment, Leila tried to write, but the words felt stuck, like a train derailed from its tracks. She would sit at her small desk, staring at the blank page, her heart heavy with doubt. The stories she once loved to create now felt like burdens, each blank line a testament to her struggle. At work, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Mr. Hawkins seemed to take pleasure in belittling her, often pointing out her mistakes in front of her colleagues. Leila felt invisible, her contributions overlooked while others basked in the limelight. Ethan, her ever-supportive friend, tried to encourage her, but his practical approach often clashed with her dreams. "Leila, you need to be realistic," Ethan said one afternoon as they shared lunch in the break room. "You've been at this for years, and it's just not happening. Maybe it's time to focus on the promotion. It's a good opportunity for you." Leila's heart sank at his words. "But what if I'm meant to be a writer? What if I give up now and regret it for the rest of my life?" Ethan sighed, his brow furrowing with concern. "I'm not saying to give up entirely, but you need to think about your future. This job could provide you with stability. Writing can be a hobby, but it doesn't have to be your career." His words echoed in her mind long after their conversation ended. As she returned to her desk, Leila felt the weight of his suggestion pressing down on her. Was she foolish for holding on to her dreams? The financial strain was becoming unbearable, and the thought of accepting the promotion began to creep into her mind like an unwelcome guest. That evening, Leila found herself back in the park, seeking refuge from the chaos of her thoughts. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape. She settled onto her favorite bench, hoping to find clarity in the stillness. Just as she began to relax, Mrs. Harper appeared, her presence like a warm embrace. "Ah, Leila, it's wonderful to see you again," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," Leila replied, forcing a smile. "I've just been thinking." "Thinking can be both a blessing and a curse," Mrs. Harper said, sitting beside her. "What troubles your heart today?" Leila hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the turmoil swirling within her. "I'm just feeling lost. I want to write, but it feels like I'm chasing a dream that's impossible to reach. Everyone keeps telling me to be practical, to take the promotion. What if they're right?" Mrs. Harper regarded her with kind eyes. "My dear, it's natural to doubt yourself. But remember, dreams are often the whispers of your soul. They guide you toward your purpose. Have you considered that God may be using this time to prepare you for something greater?" Leila looked away, the skepticism creeping back in. "I don't know, Mrs. Harper. It's hard to believe that when I feel so stuck. I keep hearing about God's plans, but what if I'm just not meant for anything more than this?" Mrs. Harper leaned closer, her voice gentle yet firm. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 reminds us that God has plans for us, plans for a future and a hope. Even when the road seems dark, trust that He is working behind the scenes. Your journey may not look like what you envisioned, but that doesn't mean it's not leading you somewhere beautiful. Leila felt a flicker of hope at the mention of the verse, but doubt quickly snuffed it out. "It's just a nice sentiment, Mrs. Harper. I wish I could believe it." "Belief is a journey, dear," Mrs. Harper replied. "Sometimes, we must take a step back to see the bigger picture. Trust in God's timing, even when it feels like nothing is happening." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the park, Leila felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Mrs. Harper's words lingered in her mind, but the weight of her doubts felt heavier than ever. Returning home, Leila sat at her desk, staring at the blank page once more. She picked up her pen, but the words refused to flow. The internal struggle between her dreams and the pressure to conform to a safer path gnawed at her. With a heavy heart, she closed her notebook, feeling as if she were standing at a crossroads with no clear direction. The dream of being a writer felt like a distant star, twinkling just out of reach, while the path of security loomed large before her, beckoning her to step away from the risk of failure. As she lay in bed that night, Leila couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of a decision that could change everything. But what if she chose wrong? What if she let go of her dreams and found herself regretting it for the rest of her life? In the silence of her room, she whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for guidance. God, if you're there, please show me what to do. I don't want to give up, but I'm so tired of feeling lost. With that, she closed her eyes, hoping for a sign, a glimmer of hope amidst the shadows of doubt. Chapter 3: Crumbling Foundations. The pressure at work continued to mount, and Leila found herself drowning in a sea of deadlines and demands. Mr. Hawkins seemed to take particular delight in piling on the tasks, his critical eye always searching for her weaknesses. Leila felt like she was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to make even the slightest mistake. As the days blurred together, Leila's writing took a backseat to the endless stream of reports and presentations. The guilt of neglecting her passion gnawed at her, but the fear of losing her job kept her tethered to her desk. Ethan, ever the voice of reason, continued to push her towards the promotion, his words laced with concern. "Leila, you need to focus on this opportunity," he said one afternoon, his brow furrowed with worry. "It could open so many doors for you. You can't keep chasing a dream that's not working out." Leila felt the weight of his words like a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders. She wanted to believe in her dream, to have the courage to keep fighting, but the doubt crept in like a persistent weed, choking out her hope. One day, as Leila sat in a team meeting, Mr. Hawkins turned his critical eye towards her. "Morrison, I noticed a discrepancy in the numbers you presented last week. Can you explain what happened?" Leila felt the blood rush to her cheeks as all eyes turned to her. She stumbled through an explanation, her voice trembling with nerves. Mr. Hawkins shook his head, clearly unimpressed. "This is unacceptable. I expect better from you, Morrison." The word stung like a slap to the face, and Leila felt her confidence crumbling. She retreated to her desk, blinking back tears of shame and frustration. Ethan approached, his expression filled with concern. "Hey, you okay?" Leila forced a smile, but the cracks in her facade were starting to show. "I'm fine," she lied, knowing deep down that she was anything but. As the workday drew to a close, Leila found herself wandering the city streets, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and despair. The towering skyscrapers seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the life she had settled for. The dream of becoming a writer, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a distant memory, fading with each step she took. In the solitude of her apartment, Leila collapsed onto her bed, the weight of her failures crushing her. She stared at the blank walls, her mind a jumbled mess of thoughts and emotions. The rejection emails taunted her, a constant reminder of her perceived inadequacy. She had poured her heart into her writing, only to be met with disappointment after disappointment. Leila felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from plummeting into the abyss of despair. The pressure at work, the doubts of her friends, and the constant rejection had taken their toll, leaving her feeling hollow and defeated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her room, Leila made a decision. She would stop writing altogether. The dream that had once fueled her passion had become a burden, a weight she could no longer bear. With trembling hands, she gathered her manuscripts, her heart heavy with resignation. One by one, she tore the pages, watching as the words she had poured her heart into disintegrated into shreds. The act felt like a betrayal, a surrender to the forces that had conspired against her. But as the last page fluttered to the floor, Leila felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. No more dreams. No more disappointment. Just the cold, hard reality of her life. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Leila felt a profound sense of emptiness. The future she had once envisioned for herself, filled with the promise of success and fulfillment, now seemed like a distant mirage. She had given up on her dream, but at what cost? In the silence of her room, Leila allowed the tears to flow freely, her sobs muffled by her pillow. She had lost more than just a dream. She had lost a part of herself. The passion that had once burned brightly within her had been extinguished, leaving behind a hollow shell of a person. As the night wore on, Leila found herself drifting in and out of a restless sleep, haunted by the ghosts of her failures. The promotion that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a noose around her neck, choking the life out of her dreams. In the depths of her despair, Leila found herself longing for the park, for the comforting presence of Mrs. Harper. But the thought of facing the kind woman's gentle wisdom was too much to bear. How could she explain the depth of her failure, the extent of her surrender? As the first rays of dawn peeked through her curtains, Leila rose from her bed, her movements sluggish and heavy. She dressed for work, her mind numb to the task at hand. The future she had once envisioned for herself had crumbled, and she was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream. Chapter 4: The Black Moment. The weeks that followed were a blur of gray. Leila trudged through her days at the office, her spirit dulled by the crushing weight of her decision. She had stopped writing entirely, convinced that her dreams were nothing more than a foolish fantasy. The manuscripts she had once cherished lay torn and discarded in a box, a graveyard of lost hopes. At work, the atmosphere felt even more suffocating. Mr. Hawkins had ramped up his criticism, finding fault in every little thing she did. Leila felt like a shadow, drifting through her days without purpose, invisible to her colleagues. The promotion that had once seemed like a beacon of hope now loomed over her like a dark cloud, a reminder of the life she had resigned herself to. Ethan continued to check in on her, his concern palpable. "Leila, you've been so quiet lately. Are you sure you're okay?" he asked one afternoon as they shared a brief lunch in the break room. "I'm fine really," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just busy with work." Ethan frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You know I'm here for you, right? If you need to talk about anything." "I don't need to talk," Leila interrupted, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "I just need to focus on my job." As the days turned into weeks, Leila's internal battle raged on. She felt like a marionette, strings pulled tight by the pressures of life, her dreams dangling just out of reach. The joy she once found in writing had been replaced by a numbing sense of defeat. One particularly grueling day, Leila sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. Mr. Hawkins had called her into his office earlier that morning, berating her for a minor mistake in a report. The humiliation had left her feeling small and insignificant. She could feel the weight of his disdain pressing down on her, suffocating her spirit. As she sat there, her mind wandered to the torn pages of her manuscripts, now hidden away in a box under her bed. The thought of them sent a pang of regret through her heart. She had given up on her dreams, but the ache of loss lingered, a constant reminder of what could have been. That afternoon, during a team meeting, Mr. Hawkins publicly criticized her once again. "Morrison, your lack of attention to detail is becoming a serious issue. If you can't keep up with the demands of this job, perhaps you should reconsider your position here." The words cut deep, and Leila felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues boring into her, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the floor beneath her. Instead, she sat frozen, her heart racing as humiliation washed over her. After the meeting, Leila retreated to the break room, desperate for a moment of solitude. She leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she fought back tears. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, and she could hardly breathe. "Leila." Ethan's voice broke through her haze, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" "No, I'm not," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I feel like I'm drowning." Ethan stepped closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to go through this alone. You're stronger than you think. Just take a day off, clear your head. You deserve it." Leila shook her head, the weight of despair heavy on her shoulders. What's the point? I've given up on everything. I'm just going to accept the promotion and settle for a life that feels empty. Ethan's eyes widened, and he reached for her hand. Leila, please don't say that. You have so much potential. You're a talented writer, and I know you can find your way back to it. Just give yourself a chance. But Leila felt like a hollow shell, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of her failures. I don't believe that anymore, she whispered, pulling her hand away. I've lost my chance. As the day wore on, Leila felt increasingly isolated. The walls of the office closed in around her, and the laughter of her colleagues felt like a distant echo. She longed for the park, for the comfort of Mrs. Harper's wisdom, but the thought of facing the kind woman felt like an insurmountable task. That evening, Leila returned home, her heart heavy with despair. The apartment felt dark and lifeless, a reflection of her emotional state. She collapsed onto her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of inadequacy. In her heart, she felt a deep sense of loss, not just for her dreams, but for the person she used to be. The passion that had once fueled her writing now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the weight of her failures. As the hours ticked by, Leila found herself spiraling deeper into darkness. The thought of never pursuing her dreams again broke her heart, but the fear of failure loomed larger than ever. She had convinced herself that she was not meant for anything more than this. In a moment of desperation, Leila picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Mrs. Harper's number. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but doubt held her back. What could she possibly say? How could she explain the depth of her despair? Finally, she set the phone down, feeling utterly defeated. She had lost her way, and the thought of reaching out for help felt like an admission of failure. Instead, she lay in the darkness, tears streaming down her face, feeling as though she had abandoned everything she once held dear. In that moment, Leila felt utterly alone, trapped in a cycle of despair. The dreams that had once ignited her spirit now felt like ashes in her hands, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost not only her passion but also her faith in a future filled with hope. Chapter 5: A Glimmer of Hope. The days that followed were a blur of monotony and self-doubt for Leila. She went through the motions at work, her mind numb to the endless stream of tasks and deadlines. The promotion that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a noose around her neck, choking the life out of her dreams. Ethan continued to check in on her, his concern palpable. But Leila brushed him off, unwilling to open up about the turmoil raging within her. She had lost faith in her dreams, and the thought of reaching out for help felt like an admission of defeat. One particularly grueling day, Leila found herself on the receiving end of yet another public humiliation from Mr. Hawkins. He had called her into his office, berating her for a minor mistake in a report, and then proceeded to criticize her in front of the entire team during a meeting. The words cut deep, and Leila felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues boring into her, their expressions a mix of pity and judgment. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the floor beneath her. Instead, she sat frozen, her heart racing as humiliation washed over her. After the meeting, Leila retreated to the break room, desperate for a moment of solitude. She leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she fought back tears. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, and she could hardly breathe. Leila. Ethan's voice broke through her haze, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, concern etched on his face. Are you all right? No, I'm not, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I feel like I'm drowning. Ethan stepped closer, his expression softening. You don't have to go through this alone. You're stronger than you think. Just take a day off, clear your head. You deserve it. Leila shook her head, the weight of despair heavy on her shoulders. What's the point? I've given up on everything. I'm just going to accept the promotion and settle for a life that feels empty. Ethan's eyes widened, and he reached for her hand. Leila, please don't say that. You have so much potential. You're a talented writer, and I know you can find your way back to it. Just give yourself a chance. But Leila felt like a hollow shell, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of her failures. I don't believe that anymore, she whispered, pulling her hand away. "I've lost my chance." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Leila cut him off. "I need to go," she said, already turning towards the door. "I'll see you tomorrow." As she walked out of the office, Leila felt a sense of relief wash over her. The thought of facing another day in that suffocating environment was too much to bear. She needed to get away, to find a moment of peace amidst the chaos. Without a clear destination in mind, Leila found herself wandering the familiar streets towards the park. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the landscape. As she approached her favorite bench, she was surprised to see a familiar face sitting there. "Mrs. Harper?" Leila said, her voice tinged with disbelief. The elderly woman looked up, a gentle smile spreading across her face. "Leila, my dear. What a pleasant surprise." Leila hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had avoided the park for weeks, unwilling to face the kind woman's wisdom. But now, as she stood before her, she felt a glimmer of hope ignite within her. I'm sorry, I should go," she stammered, turning to leave. "Wait," Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft but firm. "Please sit with me for a moment." Leila hesitated, but something in Mrs. Harper's eyes compelled her to stay. She settled onto the bench, her body tense with uncertainty. "My dear, you look troubled," Mrs. Harper observed, her gaze filled with compassion. "What weighs so heavily on your heart?" Leila felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. The words spilled out before she could stop them, a torrent of emotions she had been holding back for far too long. She told Mrs. Harper about the rejection, the pressure at work, and the overwhelming sense of failure that consumed her. As she spoke, Mrs. Harper listened intently, her eyes filled with understanding. When Leila had finished, she reached out and squeezed her hand. "My dear, I know it may not feel like it now, but God has a plan for you. Even when the path ahead seems dark, trust that He is leading you towards a future filled with hope." Leila felt a lump rise in her throat as Mrs. Harper quoted the familiar verse from Jeremiah 29 verse 11. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." The words resonated within her, a glimmer of light piercing through the darkness. But doubt still lingered, a persistent weed in the garden of her heart. "How can you be so sure, Mrs. Harper?" Leila asked, her voice trembling. "What if I've lost my chance? What if I'm not meant for anything more than this?" Mrs. Harper regarded her with kind eyes. "My dear, God's timing is not our own. He sees the bigger picture, even when we feel lost in the details. Your dreams are not a mistake. They are the whispers of your soul, guiding you towards your purpose." Leila felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her fears. "I want to believe that, Mrs. Harper, but it's so hard. I feel like I've lost everything." "You haven't lost anything, Leila," Mrs. Harper said, her voice firm. "Your dreams are still there, waiting for you to embrace them. But first, you must embrace the truth of who you are, a beloved child of God, created for a purpose." Leila felt the tears well up in her eyes, and this time, she didn't try to hold them back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her emotions. In that moment, Leila realized that she had been carrying the burden of her failures alone, unwilling to reach out for help. But as Mrs. Harper's words washed over her, she felt a sense of peace begin to settle within her. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." Mrs. Harper smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Remember, my dear, you are never alone. God is with you, and He has great things in store for your life. Trust in His timing and never lose hope." As Leila rose from the bench, she felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring within her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew that she couldn't give up, not yet. There was still a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light that refused to be extinguished. With a deep breath, Leila turned and headed back towards her apartment, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. As she walked, she felt a prayer rise up within her, a desperate plea for guidance and strength. "God, if you're there, please show me the way," she whispered into the night. "I need you now more than ever." The words hung in the air, a silent offering of her heart. And as Leila climbed the stairs to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that a new chapter was waiting to be written. Chapter 6: The Breakthrough. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Leila. After her heartfelt conversation with Mrs. Harper, a flicker of hope had ignited within her, urging her to reconsider her dreams. She still felt the weight of her doubts, but the words of encouragement echoed in her mind, reminding her that she was not alone in her struggles. Determined to reclaim her passion, Leila set aside time each evening to write, even if only for a few minutes. The blank page no longer felt like a daunting abyss. Instead, it became a canvas for her thoughts and emotions. She poured her heart into her stories, allowing the words to flow freely, unencumbered by the fear of rejection. But just as she began to feel a sense of purpose returning, the pressures of her job at the corporate office continued to mount. Mr. Hawkins was relentless, pushing her to her limits. He seemed to take pleasure in highlighting her mistakes, and the toxic atmosphere left Leila feeling drained and defeated. One particularly challenging day, Leila found herself in the break room, staring blankly at the coffee machine. She could hear the laughter of her colleagues in the distance, their camaraderie a stark contrast to her own sense of isolation. As she poured herself a cup, the weight of her circumstances pressed down on her like a heavy fog. "Leila." Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him approaching. "You've been quiet again. Is everything okay?" Leila forced a smile, but it felt strained. "I'm fine, just busy with work." Ethan studied her for a moment, concern etched on his face. "You know you can talk to me, right? I'm here for you." "I appreciate it, Ethan, really," she replied, her voice softening. "I'm just trying to focus on my writing again. It feels good to create, even if it's just for myself." Ethan's expression brightened. "That's great to hear. You should keep at it. You have a gift, Leila. Don't let anyone take that away from you." As the days passed, Leila found solace in her writing, but the pressures at work continued to weigh heavily on her. Mr. Hawkins's criticism reached a boiling point during a team meeting, where he publicly berated her for a minor oversight in a report. The humiliation stung, and Leila felt her confidence waver. After the meeting, she retreated to the park, seeking refuge in the familiar surroundings. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape, and she settled onto her favorite bench, hoping for clarity amidst the chaos. As she sat there, lost in thought, she felt a familiar presence beside her. "Hello, Leila," Mrs. Harper greeted, her warm smile instantly bringing comfort. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," Leila replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I've been trying to write again, but work has been so overwhelming." Mrs. Harper nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes, the path to our dreams is fraught with challenges. But remember, it's in those moments of struggle that we often find our greatest strength." Leila sighed, the weight of her doubts still lingering. "I want to believe that, but it's hard when I feel like I'm constantly failing." "Failure is not the end, my dear. It's simply a stepping stone on the journey to success," Mrs. Harper said gently. "Have you considered that God may be using these challenges to prepare you for something greater?" Leila felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, but doubt still lingered. "I want to trust that, but it's difficult when I feel so lost." "Take a moment to reflect on your journey," Mrs. Harper suggested. "What have you learned through this process? What do you truly desire?" As Leila pondered the question, she realized that despite the setbacks, her passion for writing had never truly faded. It had been buried beneath the weight of her fears, but it was still there, waiting to be unearthed. That evening, Leila returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. She sat at her desk, the familiar blank page before her no longer felt intimidating. Instead, it felt like an invitation, a chance to reclaim her voice. With each word she typed, Leila felt the shackles of self-doubt begin to loosen. She poured her heart into her writing, weaving stories filled with hope and resilience. The act of creation became a cathartic release, a way to process her emotions and reclaim her identity. Days turned into weeks, and Leila continued to write with fervor. She submitted her stories to various publishers, each time feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The rejections still stung, but they no longer held the same power over her. She was learning to embrace the journey, to find joy in the act of creation rather than the outcome. Then, one fateful afternoon, as Leila sat at her desk, she received an unexpected email. Her heart raced as she clicked it open, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. Dear Leila, we are pleased to inform you that we would like to offer you a publishing contract for your latest story. We believe it has great potential and would love to work with you. Overwhelmed with joy, Leila felt tears of disbelief streaming down her face. She had done it. She had taken a leap of faith and it had paid off. The dream she had thought was lost was now within her grasp. In that moment, Leila realized that, even in her darkest hours, God had not forgotten her. He had been guiding her all along, leading her back to her purpose. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. As she picked up her phone to call Ethan, her heart swelled with gratitude. She had faced her fears, embraced her passion, and emerged stronger than ever. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Leila felt a sense of peace wash over her. God, thank you, she whispered, her heart full of gratitude. Thank you for this gift, for reminding me of who I am. With renewed hope and determination, Leila prepared to embrace the next chapter of her life, knowing that she was finally walking in alignment with her purpose. The future was bright, and she was ready to face it head-on. Chapter 7. A Future and a Hope. The morning sun streamed through Leila's apartment window, casting a warm glow over the room. It felt like a new dawn, a fresh start. With her heart still racing from the news of her publishing contract, Leila sat at her desk, a sense of excitement bubbling within her. Today was the day she would meet with her publisher for the first time, and she could hardly contain her anticipation. As she prepared for the meeting, Leila reflected on how far she had come. Just a few months ago, she had felt lost and defeated, trapped in a cycle of doubt and despair. But now, she was on the brink of realizing her dreams, and the journey had taught her invaluable lessons about faith, resilience, and the importance of trusting in God's plan. After a quick breakfast, Leila dressed in her favorite outfit, a vibrant blue dress that made her feel confident and alive. She took a moment to look in the mirror, straightening her shoulders and reminding herself of the strength she had discovered within. She was no longer the woman who had felt shackled by her fears. She was a writer, ready to embrace her future. Arriving at the publisher's office, Leila felt a mix of nerves and excitement. The building was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the cramped office where she had spent so many uninspired days. As she stepped inside, her heart raced with anticipation. Leila Morrison? A friendly voice called from behind the reception desk. Yes, that's me, she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Welcome. We're excited to have you here. Please follow me, the receptionist said, leading her to a conference room. As Leila entered the room, her eyes widened at the sight of the team gathered around the table. They greeted her with warm smiles, and she felt a wave of encouragement wash over her. This was it, her moment. After a brief introduction, the head editor, a woman named Sarah, spoke. Leila, we've read your story, and we absolutely love it. Your voice is fresh, and your characters are relatable. We believe it has the potential to resonate with readers. Leila's heart soared at the praise. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much this means to me. As they discussed the details of the publishing process, Leila felt a sense of belonging that she had longed for. The team was passionate about her work, and they shared her vision for bringing her story to life. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. After the meeting, Leila stepped out into the bustling city streets, her heart light with joy. She couldn't wait to share the news with Ethan. He had been her rock throughout this journey, always encouraging her to pursue her dreams, even when she had doubted herself. Later that evening, Leila met Ethan at their favorite cafe. As she approached the table, she could see the excitement in his eyes. You look amazing. How did it go? He asked, his voice filled with enthusiasm. It was incredible, Leila exclaimed, her heart racing. They loved my story and offered me a publishing contract. I can't believe it's really happening. Ethan's face lit up with joy, and he jumped up to give her a celebratory hug. I knew you could do it. You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve every bit of it. As they settled into their seats, Leila shared the details of the meeting, her voice animated with excitement. She could see the pride shining in Ethan's eyes, and it filled her with gratitude. Thank you for believing in me, Ethan. You never gave up on me, even when I was ready to throw in the towel, she said, her voice sincere. I just knew you had it in you, he replied, a smile spreading across his face. You're a talented writer, Leila. And now the world will get to see that. As they talked and laughed over coffee, Leila felt a sense of peace enveloping her. The journey had been fraught with challenges, but each obstacle had led her to this moment. She had learned to trust in God's timing, to embrace her passions, and to believe in herself. Later that evening, as Leila returned home, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She sat at her desk. The familiar blank page before her no longer felt daunting. It felt like a canvas waiting to be filled with stories yet to come. With a heart full of gratitude, she whispered a prayer of thanks. God, thank you for guiding me through the darkness and leading me to this light. I trust that you have a plan for my future, and I'm ready to embrace it. As she opened her laptop and began to type, Leila felt a renewed sense of purpose. The words flowed effortlessly, and she poured her heart into her writing, knowing that this was just the beginning of her journey. Months later, as Leila held her first published book in her hands, she marveled at the transformation she had undergone. The cover was bright and inviting, a reflection of the hope and resilience that had carried her through the darkest moments. In that moment, she remembered the words of Jeremiah 29 verse 11. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Leila smiled, knowing that God's plans had always been greater than her own. She had faced her fears, embraced her dreams, and emerged stronger than ever. The future was bright, and she was ready to face it with an open heart, filled with hope and determination. As she stepped out into the world, book in hand, Leila felt a sense of excitement for what lay ahead. She was no longer just a dreamer. She was a writer, ready to share her stories with the world. And with each step she took, she knew that her journey had only just begun.